Hi, third graders, my special star students. As promised, Mrs. Tallon is going to come back and read our next two chapters of our classroom read aloud, which is coming from our book, The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. And we are now starting on chapter 18. But just a little refresher from yesterday, we ended the chapter where Bryce was playing his harmonica to his sister Sarah Ruth, who we know is about 4 years old and she's rather sick. And she absolutely loves Edward, who she refers to as Jangles. And the last chapter ended where they were all just together in their house, which, remember, Edward said was like no bigger than a chicken coop, kind of looked like a shed. And it started to rain real hard and thunder, and they were just all cozied up together. And so chapter 18, where we're starting today, remember, has that picture of a box with some random buttons. So let's hear and see what happens, and I'm going to read the next two chapters. So here we go. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in bed, coughing, and her father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, "I ain't never—" "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like no baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of China dolls. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth between coughs. "Jangles." She held out her arms. "He's hers," said Bryce. "He belongs to her." The father then just dropped Edward on the bed. Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed it over to Sarah Ruth. "It don't matter anyway," said the father. "It don't make no difference, none of it." "It does so matter," said Bryce. "Don't you sass me," said the father. He raised his hand and slapped Bryce right across his mouth, and then he turned and left the house. "You ain't got to worry about him," said Bryce to Edward. "He ain't nothing but a bully, and besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did not come back the next day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with the box filled with buttons. "Pretty," she said to Edward, as she lined up the buttons on the bed and arranged them into different patterns. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she would squeeze onto Edward so tight that he was afraid that he would actually crack into two. Also, in between coughing fits, she would take on to sucking onto one of the other of Edward's ears. Now, normally, Edward would have found this intrusive, clingy behavior of this sort very annoying, but there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held onto the biscuit in both of her hands and was taking small, tentative bites. "Now you eat all that up, honey. Let me hold on to Jangles," said Bryce. "Him and me got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off into the corner of the room, and with his pocket knife, he cut off a length of twine and tied it onto Edward's arms and feet. And then he tied from the twine, he tied that to a pile of little sticks. "See, all day I've been thinking about it," Bryce said. "I've been thinking about what are we going to do to make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on to her and dance her around the room." "You eating that biscuit?" Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. "Mm-hmm," said Sarah Ruth. "You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you." Bryce stood up. "Now close your eyes," he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, "Okay, you can open them now." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. "Dance, Jangles," said Bryce. And then, moving the sticks and the string with one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway all around. And the whole while this was happening, in his other hand, he held on to his harmonica and was playing a bright and lively tune. Sarah Ruth laughed and laughed until she started to cough. And then Bryce would lay Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed her back. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. "Let's get out of this nasty old air, huh?" So Bryce carried his sister outside, and he left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit was staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling and thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he would fly high above the world, to where the air would be clear and sweet. He would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms, and surely so high enough and above the world that she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. "She wants you too," he said. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth. She held out her arms. So Bryce was holding on to Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth was holding on to Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, "You gotta look for fallen stars. Them are the ones with magic." They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up into the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing, and Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. "There," she said, and she pointed to a star streaking across the night sky. "Make a wish, honey," Bryce said. His voice started to get high and tight. "That's your star. You make a wish for anything you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. What do you think Edward is making a wish for? If you had a chance to make a wish on a shooting star, what would your wish be? So let's start chapter 19. In this picture, we can see it looks like Edward is laying on the floor with his face down, his arms above his head, and it looks like maybe there's a bed nearby. Here we go. The days passed, and the sun rose and set and rose and set again and again. And sometimes the father came home, and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy. He didn't care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled, and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death, but it felt good. In the evenings, at the hands of Bryce, at the other end of the twine, Edward would dance and dance. Well, 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3, and Sarah Ruth got worse. And in the 5th month, she refused to eat. And by the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain. It was as if she was trying to remember in between breaths what to do, what breathing was. "Breathe, honey," Bryce stood over her and would say. "Breathe," thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. "Please, please breathe." Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and would hold on to Sarah Ruth in his lap and would rock her back and forth and sang to her. But on a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh, no," said Bryce. "Oh, honey, take a little breath, please." Edward at this time had now fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms that night, just before she hadn't had a chance to ask to hold on to him again. So face down on the floor, with his arms over his head, Edward was just listening to Bryce weep and cry. He listened now as the father came home and was shouting at Bryce, and then he listened as the father wept as well. "You can't cry," Bryce shouted. "You ain't got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You know nothing about love." "I loved her," said the father. "I loved her." "I loved her too," thought Edward. "I loved her, and now she's gone. How could this be?" he wondered. How could he bear to live in the world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and son continued, and there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, that she was his girl, his baby, and that he was taking her to bury her. "She ain't yours," Bryce screamed. "You can't take her. She ain't yours." But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah Ruth in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself, and then finally The boy picked Edward up. "Come on, Jangles," Bryce said. "We're leaving. We're leaving, and we're going to Memphis." Here's the picture. Shows Bryce walking and holding on to Jangles on a dirt road. Now I know that this is where we have to stop, and I will read 2 more chapters tomorrow. I know if we were in class right now, I'd have a lot of yelling saying, no, another chapter, but I like having the suspense. So I hope you're having a wonderful day, and if you're watching this at night, I hope you have the sweetest dreams, and I will come back on tomorrow and read the next 2 chapters. All right, I'll see you soon.